Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? A day or two ago, I had this really engaging discussion with a small group of friends, and it was prompted by something that Jason, Dark Age of Roleplay Games, had said about examples of, or lack of examples of, character improvement in fiction. And he was relating that to, game design, how we used, the original games used a level progression, and how the level progression exists now in some games, the lack of level progression in other games. Really cool stuff, really engaging discussion. A lot of people participated, very civil, very cool. It reminded me of another subject I had wanted to make a video on, which was tangential to that, which is this video right here, in case you haven't figured that out. And I'd started to want to make that video after watching a video by Tim Kask, and I watched it was Curmudgeon in the Cellar #3. And if you don't know who Tim Kask is, he has a YouTube channel now, but he is one of the guys that was there in the beginning. He was involved with TSR and Dungeons and Dragons and helped bring AD&D to life and edited the Dragon magazine. Doesn't matter whether you like Dungeons and Dragons or not. It's really interesting stuff. He presents it really, cool, nice guy. He talks about like how they actually played the game, what their, as opposed to what might have been in the books. Occasionally, got a little different. What their thought process was, why they did the things they did, why they designed the game the way they did. Even if you don't agree with all their design choices, it gives you this really cool insight into what was actually going through their heads at the time. And it gives you this greater understanding of why that game is what it is, and kind of like the birth of the hobby, or one of the birthplaces of the hobby for sure. But anyhow, he talked in that video a little bit about a couple of things where you discover you have a knack for something. You talked about skills, or like the lack of skills, but where did characters get their competencies from in those old games? So it got me thinking a little bit, and I posted this little small video in that group, and it actually got a really good reply from Complex Games Apologist. And so I wanted to kind of incorporate some of the stuff he said into this one, because he got me thinking a little bit more, and I wanted to kind of retool how I presented this. Complex Games Apologist talked about the idea that sometimes the competency comes from because the genre or the fiction demand that these characters have a competency in something. You may have this fiction or this genre where you need a protagonist. And of course, so then you're gonna need a person that has whatever competency list there is, so they can do the thing. And I was thinking to myself, well, that's a little bit more story game or whatever. And then I realized, well, no, it's not. Duh. Let's talk about the game I grew up with, Dungeons and Dragons. They had this fiction, they had this genre, they had this high fantasy. You need knights, you need warriors, you need wizards, you need something that's going to be a little bit like the Gray Mouse or whatever it is, because that fulfills the genre. It'd be really boring if you're playing a bunch of farmers and peasants. Not too much would happen, and the dragons would eat them all. It'd be a really fun game, but it wouldn't be Dungeons and Dragons. Peasants and Dragons, I suppose. You get the idea. And he talked about too that it made sense that the list of competencies you're going to need, the skill list. What are these foci of competence going to be? And he even talked about 2D20 Star Trek, and of course, the skill list you would need in something like Star Trek is totally different than the list you would need in a high fantasy game, which is a lot different than you would need in Leagues of Cthulhu, or which is a lot different than you'd need in, I suppose, like Musketeer role playing or whatever it happens to be. There'd be some crossover, and it'd be different like a space opera. You get the idea. There'd be some crossover, but not all together. The fiction would demand what kind of competencies or skill sets these characters might have or might be able to draw upon, because what would be most useful in that genre. So that makes a lot of sense. Taking it from a different angle, I was thinking about, especially as I watched the Tim Kask video and really got my gears turning. There's a few different ways you can approach actually getting those competencies. There can be something that's purely intentional, and this will be done at character generation. And of course, most games now, I dare say, are skill-based, and they use a skill system. So it's like Word Old Darkness. It's like Ubiquity. It's like Broken Rooms. It's like you name them, a whole bunch of games where you have some kind of points or whatever to spend on your skill set. You choose what that skill set is going to be. And you carefully figure out like what kind of character do I want to make, and what is he going to be like or she going to be like, and what kind of skills do I need in order to kind of fulfill this character concept that I'm looking for. A little tangential, but also there's games like Broken Rooms and Circle of Hands, some other games I've read recently. They have these base assumptions too that everybody's kind of skilled at like these broad things that would require them to stay alive. You don't require a die roll, say, in Broken Rooms until you start to try to do something that's somewhat difficult. And I dare say in most games you would do the same thing. You're not really going to require a skill roll of any particular type until somebody's doing something that would really necessitate either a Hail Mary pass attempt if you're unskilled, or that you're actually skilled in this particular area. Because most people are pretty broadly skilled a little bit in a whole bunch of areas. That's how they stay alive. That's how they function in the world. So, a little tangential, but anyhow. The other part that's intentional is in character generation and the beginning creation of the character is like the background, declaring a background. And that can be something as simple. Circle of Hands actually has a very codified method of doing that. It's your social status. That will give you a background. That will pretty much give you this skill list that you have. Nobles don't know how to do the things that peasants do. They have no idea how to till the earth and when to pick turnips and how to break a horse and all that kind of stuff. They might need to know, or a peasant might need to know, but they'll know all this other thing about warfare and whatever. You get the idea. Maybe I got some of the skills wrong. You understand that that's pretty easy to figure out. Or there could be something a little less codified, like we used in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, where in the Dungeon Master's Guide there was this list of secondary skills, and if you wanted to, you could pick one or two, and you could say, yeah, I used to work for a jeweler, so I can appraise things. I'm pretty good at appraising things. Or I used to work for a horse farmer, so I know some things about horses, or whatever. You get the idea. You had some kind of background, or was a woodsman, or carpenter, or whatever the heck it is. Or you can have an intentional creation of your character skill during play rather than character generation. And there's a few different ways that that can happen as well. There's something that's more codified, so to speak, a little bit, because it involves points. I remembered I played in a game with JDRD 30, Francois Letarte. We played Fudge, and that was for Brigade Con last year. And he was going through the RPG Brigade fantasy setting. And every year he tries to play in a different area of that world, but with a different particular game system. And so we were using Fudge that year. And he was talking about we didn't use that, but there's this. It's Fudge Light or Fudge Quick or Fudge whatever the heck it is, where I think I'm gonna get it a little bit wrong, but you pick like your one basic skill that you're really really good at, but then all the other points or skills you could assign 2 or 3 ranks to or whatever, you wait until you encounter something in game and you say, you know what, I think my character should be good at that. Maybe it's because we're here and we really need to open this door, or maybe it's you decide, hey, you know what, I bet you it would make sense for my character to be good at this particular thing, and so at that point you forego those points and you spend them right there rather than committing them in character generation. The other way that can happen is declaring a competency in the middle of the game, and it's not required, not tied rather to any sort of points. And Tim Kask mentioned that, the idea that you show up at a particular area and you realize it might be kind of useful for me to know this sort of thing. So you come upon, say, the horse that has broken its rope but it's still trailing this big long rope. It gets tied around a bush. The horse is panicked now, and you say, you know what? I used to work on a horse farm. I have a knack with animals, and so you go and you declare some kind of competency at that particular point. And that something like that requires mature players. It requires a strict adherence to genre. It requires trust. It requires just pretty much being grown-ups. But that can be a lot of fun to discover your character in play in an intentional manner that way. However, the thing that Tim Kask talked about that I found the most compelling was he talked about finding out that your character has a knack for that. And I've had this happen. I never did it in such a codified manner, although I don't think what he was talking about was really that codified either. But it was really cool to listen to, where you say pretty much they're playing back in the day, and they come upon a situation, and you declare to the game master, I try to do this. And so let's say we're back to that horse that's tied up in the bush, and you say, I try to calm this animal down and see if I can untangle him. And the game master says, okay, go ahead, roll for it. And generally, Tim didn't say like how they were rolling for it, but I'm guessing, and I put $5 on the fact that they probably rolled a D6, and the game master said, okay, try for low. You got to roll a 1, or maybe a 1 or a 2 if the game master was feeling generous that day. And the first time your character encountered something like that, if they succeeded, it was kind of determined that your character had a knack for that. And at that point, based on the dice roll, you now had a knack. And now maybe you had a knack with animals. You're really good at that. I found it incredibly entertaining because a couple days later, after watching that video, I was a game master for a game of Lamentations of the Flame Princess. It's not really important what game it was, except that it doesn't really have a codified skill system except for the specialist. Now, there was a character that had an average charisma. And they had a 9. It's not really important. It's low average, but it has no mechanical modifier associated with it whatsoever. And what this character tried to do over and over again was negotiate with people, convince people to do something. It was the kind of things where, like, I would call for a die roll simply because they were. If you or I try to do these things, try to negotiate or convince or somebody to do what this character wanted to do, it was kind of iffy. It could go either way, right? So there's a reaction roll built right into that game. It's an old D&D mechanic. It's 2d6. You want to roll high. Lamentations uses the same mechanic because it's based on basic D&D. And this player kept on rolling low for his character. Like, he failed abysmally over and over and over again. And so there's nothing mechanically on his character sheet that says, Reginald is really bad at negotiating with people or convincing people to do things. But at that point, we started to realize that he didn't have a knack for negotiation. He had a serious deficit in that. He was not the guy that you want to try to convince somebody to, come around to your way of thinking. And so we're probably going to, play that character or play up that little flaw or shortcoming that Reginald has. And, that's kind of neat. So once again, we've discovered in play, that the character didn't have a knack for that. So, I always talk about the fact that I like to discover my character in play, and usually what I'm talking about is I come to the table with an idea, a character concept. I kind of know what their motivations are. The more time we've had, beforehand, especially if we do like a session 0 and as players we're kind of riffing off each other a little bit, I come with an idea of what my character is going to be like, but I don't really discover really who the character is until we play and, interactions with the other characters, with the game world, etc. The campaign starts to develop a feel, or the game starts to develop a feel, and then I discover who that character is. I really find it very compelling. Not saying you have to do this or this is the best way to do it, just where do these competencies come from. I like this idea of discovering the competencies of your character in play via a mechanic like a dice roll, where you determine he's really good at this or he really sucks at that. I think that's really kind of entertaining. But that leads to the discovery of the character. All these methods lead to discovery of the character, whether it's character generation or intentionally determining or declaring in play, via spending a resource like a point, a fudge point, or whatever, whatever it is, those your skills. You know what I'm talking about. You're spending a resource, a limited resource to assign to skills in game, or whether you're declaring it, or whether you're simply rolling for it and you're purely discovering what that character is like. You discover the character. And discover what they're competent at. And of course, there are some broad skill sets that are where your competencies come from, and these could be called things like classes. And it's funny, Complex Games apologists talked about that, how those old school, and I'm not defending them, but the old school D&D classes felt too big. They're really big, and they were big umbrellas. And I'll be honest with you, I preferred playing those core big classes like the fighter or the wizard or what have you, because things like the subclasses like the paladin and the ranger didn't really speak to me. But if I played a warrior, and a lot of times I like to play a fighter, that gave me this great amount of latitude to play the kid that ran away from home, that's just good at fisticuffs, or the nobleman, or the knight, or the barbarian. And when I played a barbarian in a game like that, where there wasn't this big skill set, he had barbarian skills like surviving outdoors, and he knew how to hunt rabbits and, maybe tan hides and whatever, because he was a barbarian. This is just, once again, a declared background that I brought to the table. So just because those classes were really big didn't mean that we couldn't narrow them down to some really specific skill sets. Not being an apologist for that, but that is part of how that those games happened, or you declared your competencies in a game like that, where you discover your character's competencies were. But I think at the end, it still goes back to the genre. I think genre is number one. Like, what are you trying to emulate? What should that skill list be? CGA talked about in something like the 2D20 Star Trek, the idea that you can declare these other skills, and it's kind of fuzzy, like what they would be, your foci. And he even mentioned, one of the creators mentioned that you'd be kind of doing yourself a disservice to say your foci or your specialization in that focus was that you're really good at everything, because you'd be doing yourself and the other players a disservice. A game like Broken Rooms actually talks about that. If you're going to add another skill to the game, or another specialization or focus, it has to be something that makes sense. And I think in all those cases, it has to make sense, for the genre. When you're playing Star Trek, you don't necessarily need a character. You're breaking the genre if you say you're good at everything. You're breaking the genre in something like tech noir, if you have a character that's just really good at infiltrating, say, gangsters' homes and whatnot, because at some point you're no longer playing noir, you're playing some badass assassin that's going in to kill the gangster and solve all your problems that way. So yeah, the competencies, that where they come from, to me it's a really compelling topic. Hopefully the video wasn't too rambly, but it's something that has been interesting me more and more. Maybe this is about game design or game preference. I'm not really sure. But what do you think about all this?